name is Derek Lee. I am the founder of Pilot City, as well as co-chair for the NIST Education Supercluster. I'm going to pass it over to Shannon Williams, my co-chair for the NIST Education Supercluster, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Williams Mitchum, and I, along with Derek Lee, am the co-chair of the Education Supercluster. Welcome to our very first event in our Digital Blueprint series. The Education Supercluster is a part of the Global City Teams Challenge, a public-private partnership hosted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. And it's designed to gather and share knowledge to improve the quality of life for our cities and communities through the effective deployment of advanced technologies. In this era of fast-paced innovation and digital transformation, the need to engage communities, promote inclusion, and prepare students and citizens for this evolved economy is critical. The Education Supercluster is a diverse group of really passionate people who are experts in a variety of fields with a common goal to promote conversations and information sharing that enable and encourage the deployment of advanced technologies in a way that, actually improves quality of life in a fair, equitable, and sustainable way. So over the next several weeks, our group will be hosting conversations with change makers who have made tremendous impacts on regions throughout the US and globally through their efforts to support the transformation of our community's most valuable organizations and institutions to be more effective and resilient in this modern world. Today, we'll be discussing the role of libraries in the new digital economy with Neville-Bonilla, Director of the California Research Bureau at the California State Library, hosted by our two esteemed members, Deborah Acosta, former Chief Innovation Officer of the City of San Leandro, and Ann Marcus, Director of Strategic Communications for Marcus Consulting Group. With that, I'll hand the rest of the discussion over to Debbie to introduce our speaker and facilitate the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Shannon and Derek, for that great introduction. I'm delighted to be sharing the stage here today with two people that I've been working with for quite some time. And Marcus, who continues to be one of my collaborators in a number of different projects, including a very exciting podcast TV documentary series. And then Ann Neville-Bonilla, who, my goodness, Ann, I think you were one of the first people, you and Jean Rice, who reached out to me when I was a fledgling Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Leandro, not really sure what I should be doing, but you immediately brought me and San Leandro into the national narrative, for which I will be forever grateful. So I'm really delighted that this is the first conversation that we're going to be having together. So you actually have a really interesting background. So you're going to forgive me and us if we dwell on that for just a little second. I was really fascinated with something I read this morning, that when you were introduced and brought on board to the state of California as the director of the California Research Bureau, something here that says, Neville grew up in Berlin, Connecticut, so across the country, and became interested in technology as a child. We're talking about education. We're talking about women being engaged in technology. What was it as a child that drew you into as an interest in technology?
So that's really interesting. So actually, it's Berlin, Connecticut. We strangely, it's a little town of about 10,000, and it does not, it pronounces it differently, like everything in Connecticut. We don't have the Thames, we have the Thames River, etc. So, like a lot of people who sort of found their way into technology, I stumbled upon it. My dad was a mathematician and got really interested in computer science, and we had a Commodore 64. And he basically said, play with stuff, you're not going to break it. And that's what I would do. I would just start going, into files, and I would start trying commands and see what would happen. It turned out it made me a really good troubleshooter. When I was in college, I found myself, always being the person some of my friends would come to try to figure out what was going wrong with their computer. And one of my friends one day said, they pay you for that. I said, no one would pay me for that. Come on. And it turned out that they would actually. But that was, that was really how I got engaged, was just this idea that it was exploration. And later on, when I had the opportunity to do some of that same kind of work in a teaching role, that was what we really tried to emphasize, that it was all about trying and experimentation, and that if you weren't afraid of potentially messing something up, then it gave you the ability to use your imagination in different ways.
It's the important lesson of appreciating failure as part of the education process, right? I mean, there just couldn't be more critical than that. So you actually won an award recently. So your journey has taken you as an administrator. So you've gone from, you started off with being a Vista volunteer, and has taken you now to actually being prominent in public administration across the country. And you recently won an award in 2019 at the Elizabeth Hill Public Administrator of the Year Award. Well, as you know, public service has taken quite a hit in recent years, and it's certainly the last 4 years has not helped any of that. What initially drew you to a career in public service, and how did your stint with AmeriCorps as a Vista member, how did that influence your career path?
Yeah, well, so I joined AmeriCorps Vista for a year of service. Early on in my career, I'd come out of undergraduate and was in a financial services firm that I loved what we were doing. I was one of the first online firms, getting people engaged in the market. But it was hard for me that it was only about the bottom line, and not really. I was really interested in helping educate people, making sure that they had the tools to be able to be the kind of self-investors that we were saying that this new online world was going to facilitate. And I wanted more. And AmeriCorps offered me that opportunity. So I had the opportunity to serve a community, to learn from and with our program participants. And together we ended up building a really amazing technology center that served youth, parents, and seniors in San Diego. And it was, for me, I did a lot, but I probably learned more than I gave. And the people that we worked with, both my colleagues at the YMCA and the program participants in the community, were all just amazing people who brought these different ideas to the table. And that's what really, I didn't come into Vista thinking I was going to stay in nonprofit land and then move into, sort of the government side. But the ability to kind of help support and facilitate that kind of change was what kept me there.
So it sounds like there became a dissatisfaction with just working for the corporate bottom line, which I can totally relate to, having spent several years with Crocker and then Wells Fargo Bank. It's like you're doing this work, but it's going to the shareholders. So looking for something different and bigger and how to engage community in that. And it sounds as if that resonance with you took hold. And so that started you on your public path, which led you into one of my favorite topics, broadband infrastructure. This is where we actually first met, right? So it was so exciting back in when Obama became president. We were trying to figure out how to get out of the recession that we were in. And lo and behold, there's this thing called fiber optics. And I in Oakland had been learning about this, and people were telling me, no, this is the future. This is the future. I don't know what you think is going to happen, but fiber optics, if you're not connected to it, it won't matter. So in 2008 or 2010, an amazing thing happened. There was a convergence of public-private partnerships, done a little differently, but still the ARA grant program, the BTOP program said, hey, United States, we're looking for projects across the United States to increase access to broadband, right? And of course, then at the same time, Google announced its initiative that it was going to pick one or two and then several cities in order to initiate its broadband infrastructure initiative. So a lot has happened since then. In that regard, you were actually director of, I want to make sure that I get this right, at Broadband USA, you were responsible for the, let's make sure, the tell me what it was again to make sure I get it right, because I see several different names that is a tribute.
Yeah. So, well, as you probably know, the broadband the broadband programs at NTIA went through some changes, but I was brought on board to run what was called the State Broadband Initiative, and that was a project first to build a national data set and a map or visualization tool of broadband availability across the country, partnering with all 50 states. And then it was also about providing grant funding to states to be able to support what their vision of a digital economy looked like. And that really, really differed depending on the state, because every state had different priorities and was in different places. But we had really two pieces of that grant program. And so, we built what was then the National Broadband Map, which is different from the mapping tools that are available today at the FCC. And that project was really based in a partnership, a real true collaboration with the different states that we worked with. And we were doing something that had not been done before. At that point, there had been a couple of states, including California, North Carolina, Kentucky. North Carolina had been the first very, very early on who had done mapping, and California had completed our first maps of availability and speed about 2 years before. We were all looking for what was the best way to do this, right? What was the way, getting this kind of data it's hard. It's different from looking for physical attributes like sinkholes in the ground, right? And we worked very closely with providers, particularly many of the national providers who had footprints in many states. But the states worked very closely with providers, and for them, many of the local providers who were only in those areas. And we were really looking for the balance of how to get the best information, and also different ways to verify that information. No one knew what the best way was. And I still don't think there's one best way. It depends both on the kind of technology, but also the challenges that the states had in the past. Different topographies can mean different things. And so we really encouraged a collaborative space where, yes, you got a grant to do these things, but we were also grant makers who were open to change. And if something wasn't working, we wanted to know early, and we wanted to work together to look at new ways to be able to try to get to the final objective, and be able to do that early on, so that you didn't have to change course, or you were no longer able to change course because it was just too late at that point. And that was for me, it was an amazing project, because we really, it was a different kind of collaboration. And it also was a lot about building trust, which I think, coming from, local government, you sure know that, right? Being able to build that trust with other government entities, which can be hard when there's a different history. And also with the stakeholders who are all coming from very different places, with both in terms of the opportunities they bring, but also the limits on what they can do, and trying to really thread that needle. And that's what we really worked on in that program.
Well, so it's curious, because that was the first time that I think that nationally we really had a focus on what broadband was. I'm interested in why that was, and the reason for that is because we're in a different place today. We've had 4 years of the FCC trying to redefine what broadband is, and slowing down speeds and expectations for who can access it and who doesn't. What was it that spurred the Obama administration to really focus on broadband? What lessons can we learn from that as we go into 2021 with a new administration? Doesn't matter whether it's the old administration or really a new one. What lessons can we learn from that to really move a broadband infrastructure initiative forward, which both candidates have been talking about? Clearly, the Democratic candidate has been talking more about that. What lessons have we learned from that from 2010 that we can bring into 2021 with implementation of broadband, especially at a large scale?
Well, I think it's, I can speak from the time that I was fortunate enough to join the administration and working on these topics. But we always reminded people that ARA was not just about recovery. It was also about reinvestment, right? It was 2 R's, recovery and reinvestment. And that was part of what broadband was. There were jobs, right? There were definitely jobs putting back folks to work, and my colleagues in BTOP can talk an awful lot about that. And but it was also about building that infrastructure investment that that I think had been. There were no shortage of people who thought that was really important and had been, but there hadn't been an opportunity for such a widespread funding mechanism before that point. It's a mixture of both political will and timing at the point when people understand the value. And you were starting to really see some of those economic studies coming out demonstrating what had happened in communities that had gotten high capacity internet access and those capacities where it had been passed by. But I also think it's important to remember that the federal government had been talking about this and for a very long time, and it's been great to hear so many people really underscoring the importance of the digital divide. As everything has been, the sort of underbelly has been exposed during the pandemic. But we also have to remember that it was during the Clinton administration that the term digital divide came to be, and early papers published by NTIA, the Falling Through the Net papers in the in the early 90s when Larry Irving was assistant secretary. That started so much of this, and BTOP, right, was that the predecessor to BTOP was the TOP program, the Technology Opportunities Program, which was funding really innovative examples of technology use in communities. And so I think there's been this work has continued. It was that then there was finally the opportunity to really support some infrastructure and adoption efforts at a much greater level than had ever been possible before.
So in the past, it's kind of like we were all talking to each other. So whether it's the TOP program or the BTOP program, while we talk about civic engagement and connectivity, it's kind of hard, and we really haven't done such a great job of it, right? So we have always talked about stakeholders in the broadband world, and we think about the businesses, and we think about government, and folks like that obviously need a connectivity. What's the responsibility of individual stakeholders, people who live in the community? And I know that the work that you're doing in the library system, which we're going to talk about in a minute because it's really exciting. What is the individual responsibility in terms of engaging with this work and making sure that they're part of it? And what should they be doing?
That's a really good question. I mean, I continue to believe that local broadband planning is really important. And in fact, that was a lot. We funded local broadband planning efforts through the State Broadband Initiative in almost every state. And the ones we didn't, it was mostly because they already had those funded, like in California. I think the local planning efforts need to be linked to regional planning efforts, but these tend to be when we're looking at areas that are and unserved. We've got there are local assets and local challenges, and we need to be able to know what those are. The anchor institutions that are we've tended to talk about anchor institutions in a sort of public way, schools and libraries and hospitals. But they're also just as important, the private businesses, right, that are anchors in those communities. And that's why it's always really important to have both the folks who understand the technology, the folks who understand the economic development, and the folks that understand the regulatory origins, right? All of those three are really important because those are both levers and constraints. And you may not have all of that knowledge locally, but that's also part of what the benefit of, the state broadband offices can bring to bear, is providing some of that technical assistance. And that certainly happened in a lot of places. It happened during, when we were funding things, we also funded a lot of state broadband offices to support some of those larger planning efforts. But I think we have to be able to, I don't want to encourage a zero-sum look at the problem where we know, but we also know that nothing is free, right? And so there are trade-offs. And so being able to develop trust in a community amongst the players, all of the stakeholders, and being able to say, yes, we're investing in this, and maybe that means we're delaying X or Y, or maybe it means that we're speeding up this other process, but we've got to be able to have that deliberative and honest process. And I think that's part of what's really important in that local planning kind of effort.
So there are trade-offs, and the reality about broadband is it is expensive, and it's very difficult, although many cities, including my city of San Leandro, has private-public partnerships that have built private municipal broadband networks because the incumbents were not filling the needs of the community. So before we get on to your work in the library, I do want to talk about CENIC, because CENIC, tell me what it stands for, because no one ever seems to know. But
the Corporation for Educational Network Initiatives in California.
There you go. So it's a second internet that connects educational institutions and research institutions across California and increasingly across the Pacific. So it's the Pacific Rim. So it's really widening. So with that, they started off as this research provider, but they're beginning to realize now, holy smokes, we're in these communities with community colleges connected, with universities connected, but the students who are living outside necessarily of the university bubble in their cities and their towns don't necessarily have access to broadband. So CENIC is now starting to provide that kind of last mile connectivity out into the communities. So that's really interesting. So there are quite a few private providers, private sector internet providers, service providers, like AT&T, Time Warner, Comcast, the folks that we've come to rely upon, that offer internet connectivity to consumers, institutions, and businesses in California, as there are across the US. So they're everywhere across the US. CENIC, which is a nonprofit, along with services offered by various municipalities, have been increasingly offering alternatives to the private sector ISPs. Why is this happening? I mean, within our group, we know why this is happening, but I'd like you to articulate for our audience, why is this happening? And why are municipal providers and such are starting to step in where traditionally private sector has filled that role?
Got it. Well, I would maybe differentiate a little bit between the work of the research and education networks, the R&E networks, of which CENIC is one. Many states have an R&E network, and they've been around, and many other countries do as well, and they've been around since the dawn of the internet, because in order to have the capacity and the resiliency to support the kind of amazing research that propels our nation forward, it required something that the the commodity internet wasn't able to offer. And there are some wonderful examples of that kind of work in California and across the country. I am very fortunate to be a board member of CENIC. I represent the library, the library segment. So. But CENIC has always served the higher education community, all of the higher education community in California, with the UCs and some of the privates, and then the CSUs. Later, bringing on the community colleges. K-12 is all served by CENIC, and libraries have been the last segment to be added. Because we are part of the education fabric of our state, as all public libraries are. And, when I look at that, I look at a little bit differently than the municipally owned or operated, ISP. And I think there, we have, there's always been, historically, there's always been some debate about the role of whether today municipal ISPs, there was in the mid 2000s, there was Muni Wi-Fi, right? But essentially the local government providing some sort of subsidized broadband service, right? And I think the importance has always been that that folks have seen that you can't grow your local economy without broadband infrastructure. I think too long we've been divorced from the idea about the importance of adoption as well, right? Because it doesn't matter how great your infrastructure is. If people aren't able to use it, if it's not affordable, and if people don't have the devices and they don't have the skills, it doesn't really matter. But the first step in that pyramid is having the infrastructure. And so, when the market isn't able to provide that, you've seen more and more municipalities look at, it may be owned and operating. It may simply be subsidizing with a partner. It may not be a municipality. It may be an electric utility or water, someone else who already has infrastructure on the ground or in the air, right? And is able to leverage that for this additional purpose. And I think part of it is you're seeing more of that happen now because frankly, it's been around longer, right? I mean, some of the early pioneers in this, there were, as there always are, there were mixed successes and some places where it didn't work. Some places where initially there was a time where we looked at some cities that, that didn't look like maybe that was an investment that was going to pay off. And now they're doing really well. And, so there's been enough time to be able to really see this through and see what's happening. And I think that's a little bit of why you're seeing more of that now, but also because it's no longer become a nice to have. It's not a, well, gosh, this will differentiate us from this other community. It's necessary. I think right. That's it. If anything, the pandemic has just exposed how, that the cost of being offline or being underserved for communities and businesses today is it's not just a gosh, you can't compete as well. It's you can't compete at all.
Right. So I love that you're now bringing this technology into the library. So Scenic over the past 6 years has connected most of the California public libraries, probably somewhere between 80 and 90%. Mm-hmm. Generally, how has this improved technology and service changed library services? And do you feel that this has been offered equitably across, all California communities? Do you have suggestions for improvement?
Well, I think maybe a good way to start is just to mention, for your listeners, the reason libraries are able to afford high capacity broadband is because of E-rate. And, schools and libraries, some healthcare organizations are eligible for E-rate subsidies. In California, we also have an additional program called the California Teleconnect Fund, which provides an additional discount. But just to give you a sense, depending on where the library or school is located, it's a 20 to 90% discount on that monthly broadband bill. And then our California Teleconnect Fund provides an additional 50% off of that. And so that is the difference for, libraries, many of which, many of the smaller libraries operate on very, very limited budgets and, do so much in their community. And it's the difference between being able to do, having the capacity that, to do something and to do nothing. And before the partnership with Scenic, we had a lot of libraries who had very slow speeds. So one of the things that working with Scenic, we've been able to really look at and through CNIC have been able to put out RFPs for all the libraries that need services. You know, there are some places where it's really easy to get bids back, right? You know, LA County, right? There's no shortage of providers that can serve libraries. You know, but in other parts of our state there are, and we do still have areas where we have not received a bid, or the bids we get back are just simply too expensive. They're just not possible. And so we are working very closely with our counterparts with schools, and looking at collectively how do we be able to support and look at where we can bring in different kinds of funding sources. But the difference it's made is, you know, it's the difference in a library between when you had a fairly slow internet connection, and if there were too many people in the library using the public Wi-Fi, the staff wasn't able to do the things that they needed, right? Whether it was archival, whether it was catalog, whether it was research, all of that, you didn't have the ability. Now that's gone. In other places where that wasn't a problem to begin with, you've had this change where now people are, instead of thinking in a constraint mentality about what they're limited to because of their capacity, people can let their imaginations kind of run wild with the kinds of programs that they're able to do and the diversity of programs that they're able to run at one time. And so that's really, really important. And, you know, more so because, you know, in California, we have, 180 some odd library jurisdiction, but it's 1,200 points of service, right? Around 1,200 libraries around the state where people can come to. And they come, you know, it's free, it's safe, it's warm, it's a place to find information, it's a place to get, but it's also, you know, where you can sign up for public benefits. You can get information as a veteran looking for resources on veteran services. There are close ties with libraries and immigration to be able to provide education and services to new immigrants to the country. So there are so many different ways, and now that capacity is not such an issue, it allows people to reimagine and rethink the kinds of programming that they can do.
So it's made a huge impact, is what you're saying, is what librarians are able to offer. I mean, I see it even in my own library. I mean, Teresa has gone into, we're going to do maker spaces. It's all connected to technology. We're having events around these things. We're doing hackathons. We're doing, oh my gosh, we're creating apps. We're inviting the community to come in and create apps that make it easier to access library services. I mean, I see it in my own community. So, and San Leandro, by the way, while we may be in the Silicon Valley, technically, until Lit San Leandro came along, our broadband services were horrible. The incumbents were not willing to bring in what we needed. So it isn't just being part of the Bay Area that makes you that gives you access to these wonderful resources.
And that's why that's why it's so important that this planning gets done locally. Because exactly as you just said, right? You may be technically part of that geography, but you know, residents may experience a very different life.
Very differently. So now let's talk about data, right? Because data is it's the thing that we all talk about, but the average person's like, I don't understand. You know, I don't understand what that's about or what it has to do with my life. Yeah, I hear about security cameras and they're taking pictures of me and I don't know what that means, but so let's talk about data. And you have really focused a lot on data in your life, data access and management, and on using those resources for community outreach and education. So today, so you previously managed a grant-funded, no, you didn't. You now are managing a grant-funded project through the California State Library System that promotes data literacy by training librarians and community members how to find, use, and give advice on the power of data. Oh my gosh, talk about community engagement at the granular level, right? It's called Data Equity for Main Street. It was founded by the Knights Foundation, and you shared responsibility for creating this program with staff from Washington State and Nevada. So talk to us about what open data, what is it, and why is it important?
Yeah, well, so this was an exciting program. The program is actually, it is pretty much over at this point in terms of that first phase. And it was a joint project with the state of Washington, which is something that we built in early on because we really wanted the project to be able to work nationally. And we knew if we did it in just one of our states, we'd make it either very California focused or very Washington focused. By making it something that worked for all the libraries in both of our states, it meant that it's going to be able to be scaled to any state. And so the idea here was that there's a lot of, libraries have always been about finding information. Data is part of information. And, reference, whether it's reference services or whether it's, teaching people how to go in and use, there are a lot of public libraries have areas to support entrepreneurs and small businesses and getting them the market information that they need. More and more local governments, state governments, federal governments, and international organizations have been making data publicly available, making it publicly available in a standardized way, and providing the information and the context so that people can use it well. And by, taking data that is, stored in, we in government, we still publish far too many things in PDF, right? But when you can take the data off of the page, when you can, and someone can consume it in whatever way they want, they can put it into another chart. They can use it for their business research. They can use it to advocate locally. You are empowering people especially at the government level, with information that is, that should be available. It was paid for, right? It was collected with taxpayer dollars. Now, sometimes there's most certainly data that should not be made available, right? That the kind of data that has personally identifiable information and things like that. But there are, when we developed the broadband map the first time, one of the pieces that was really important to us was making the underlying data really publicly available. And it was for two reasons. Was one, we're not so confident in ourselves to believe that even though we went through a lot of design work to build a really nice interface, that we would have the best interface, right? You make it available to people in a way they can then take it and do what they want to do with it, right? Demonstrate it in a different way. The other side was that it creates transparency. We may still disagree if that data is right or wrong, but at least the person who thinks it's wrong can say, I think this is the specific data is wrong. When you're just given a pretty map or a pretty visual or something that's stuck in a chart on a page and you can't do anything with it, it's very hard to argue against it. You're stuck essentially arguing against a negative. And so, sorry, there are some dogs in the background.
That's okay.
So, it is, I think that is a real challenge. And it's something that I think open data can help formulate and develop that trust in a community.
So you have an interesting intersection here. So we talked about in this day and age, the average stakeholder, the average citizen becoming more involved, educating them, understanding the importance of this. How do they become involved with open data, and especially in the library system with this particular focus that you have of teaching librarians about open data, what open data sets are important, and how do they actually connect that to the average citizen, and how can the average citizen purposefully engage with that conversation or programs at the library?
Well, what we did is we developed a curriculum, and it was built by a group of civic technologists and librarians. And the idea was to train librarians so that they were then able to train their community members. We put the curriculum online, so everything is available at data-equity.org. And the whole curriculum is available. We also have a really great 2-minute video that, it doesn't say anything about our program. It doesn't say anything about the background. It just explains what open data is. And we wanted people to be able to use that in whatever format or context, they have. But people understanding that they can look for school district, information about school district quality, that they can look at local government pothole information, that, and what we, when we started the program, we didn't start it from really an advocacy perspective in thinking about how do you turn local community members into advocates for open data if it wasn't there. But when we got to the end of it, that's what part of what we saw was that if we had folks who were really excited about this, but their local government wasn't doing it yet, it then became a question of not going and demanding, but going and asking and saying, hey, is this something that we could start doing? How could we help with that? In our libraries are in this wonderfully unique position that they are trusted by so many people. They have this incredibly high trust rating, and they're part of government. A lot of people don't always remember that they're part of local government. And so they have the opportunity to go and talk to their local, the local technology department or the GIS team and find out what's being made available, if it can be made available in a different way. All of those things. And we, in fact, we had a number of communities where first thing we said to the librarians was go and talk to your city and see where you guys are right now, right? If you didn't already have a portal. And, in one community, they went to the department, the IT department, and the IT department said, well, we were just starting to think about doing this. We thought it was really important. Man, we'd love to have libraries at the table. Not just because you're so connected to the community, but libraries also think a lot about privacy. Privacy is and the right of an individual to privacy. And so thinking about that and helping develop that balance is a really unique and wonderful position for libraries to be in and to come to the table with.
So it sounds as if libraries actually can be that center place where community can engage, at least in understanding there's something out there. This thing about data and open data, it is important. And I do need to be curious about what my city is doing in terms of that. And in my own work across the country, I'm finding the same thing. People are starting to think about this, and schools and everything, they're coming together at a common meeting point going, oh, you were thinking about this too? Well, maybe we should have a plan together. So I think that since libraries are an important part of our US education system, it could be a really good starting point. I mean, schools as well, but that seems to be, because E-rate makes it kind of squirrely about what kind of services you can fund under E-rate. We still have some work to do around that. But so you do it. So part of this education system is funding. You talked about funding. Well, you've also initiated something very important in the state library system, which is the state grants portal. Could you talk about that, and how does that relate to the work of education, connectivity, policy, especially as it relates to broadband?
So in the state of California, like in many states, there was not a single place to be able to find grants. So folks were, if you were searching for a grant offered by the state of California, you went to the website for the department or the commission that was offering the grants. And many departments have wonderful and close relationships with the communities and the constituencies that they serve. And so they have listservs and they do outreach activities. And that has hit a lot of folks. But there's certainly there's certainly something that isn't there when there's no single place that you can go and you can look across that you can look across the different kinds of projects and see how many are, that there may be something, you may be more of an environmental organization and generally look at things that are at, say, Cal Recycle, which is our recycling department. But then knowing that there might be something very similar over in the Health and Human Services Agency, and you didn't know about that because it wasn't quite the world you operate in, right? And we're really familiar with that in broadband, right? Because there used to be very little direct funding for broadband, and so you'd have to see, okay, can I get something from health and telehealth and education and distance learning, and maybe there's some CDBG funds, right? And together we can cobble that into something. And so the idea for this was really building something that would work both for the state grant makers, who are the ones who are giving out the grants, and for the grant seekers. And so we really, when we look at government, we look at government services, we really wanted to look at this both in an iterative way, where we were building something that, we had less than a year to put something together. And, we launched in the middle of the pandemic. We launched on July 15th. And it was about, we were disrupting the outreach process that grant programs already had, right? And we didn't even know how many grant programs there were, right? Because there was no single place that it was all captured. And so we were guessing. We did a lot of early surveys. We met consistently with grant makers to understand where would this come in their process? How would we do things like logins? How would we get them to be able to post their information? Because we did not want people to send us information and then we post it, right? Much like we did when we were building the broadband map, we said, this is your information and your data. We're just providing a common frame for it now. And that was the work of it. And similarly on the grant seeker side, it was, what did folks want to find? How did they want to find it? What were the things early on that we wouldn't have even thought about? Is we would not have thought about whether folks should be able to search for if grants were reimbursement or whether they were upfront. Oh. But that's a huge issue, right? That's a huge issue. And so we made that something that you could search by, right? So that, because that really, grants go to nonprofits, they go to local governments, they go to businesses in agriculture, they may, and in the environment, they may go to individual landowners. So there's so many different ways, and it's a really complex ecosystem. But the library was a wonderful place to have this, because the state library is all about providing information to the people of California. And so this was a way that we could take all of this disparate information across a bunch of different state departments and then be able to put it in one place. Because, right, if you're a community member or if you're a nonprofit in Sonoma County, you don't care which department is offering it. You care about whether it's for the subject that you have a grant need to fill.
Right. No, that actually, I can't even begin to describe to you how critical that was. I'm going to give you an example of, again, San Leandro. Its first application to the Economic Development Administration for a broadband grant was out of the blue. EDA had never received an application like that before. And it was because it was seen as economic development infrastructure that they were like, okay, we haven't heard of this before, and then they came over, they flew in and they kind of felt their way around, kicked the dirt a little bit and said, okay, we're not sure, but we think this is a thing. So let's do it. So they funded actually the very first municipal fiber optic grant from the EDA was in San Leandro. Since then, they've done many, many more. And that's the point, is that broadband it's a connectivity tool that's critical in the digital age. And I think we're going to see an acceleration of that. And the point is that you're able, through this broadband portal, the grant portal, you can just look everywhere. Okay, I have this need, it's very specific, but I can look across a variety of administrations to say, who cares about this? I mean, in other words, if it's a medical broadband initiative, but it serves other stakeholders as well, okay, maybe we can apply under this one, and it serves a bunch of different stakeholders. So that's brilliant. What are the reactions that you've received from this? Have you seen noticeable improvement? Are you tracking data of any sort, and what are you tracking?
Absolutely. I mean, so first, I should also mention all of the website is grants.ca.gov, and all of the data is available on our state's open data portal, right? And this is another great example of, on data.ca.gov, any department can post the data. I don't have to develop an API because when I put my data up there, it creates the API for me so that someone can. And so we update it every 24 hours so anyone can pull from it. We have a couple of economic development groups that we know are because they're integrating it into other kinds of data that they have for their clients, which is great, right? Then, we are tracking, we're tracking a lot of different information. The first, of course, is we want to see who's visiting, where they're visiting from, and how long they stay. So for us, it's been great. We've had about 35,000 unique visitors since we launched, which is, considering that this is not a website that the general public is going to go to. This is a website that is mostly going to be local governments, nonprofits, small, businesses looking for grants. But for us, the big barometer of success has been average time on site has been about 3 minutes. 3 minutes and 40 seconds, I think.
That's pretty good.
And that means people are coming and they're staying, right? The other thing is that there are a number of places where we don't want people to come if there's nothing for them, right? We thought, well, gosh, that's a really disappointing experience. You're all excited and then you go on and there's nothing for you. So we allowed people we set up a tool, a function so that people could create, people can get, an email notification anytime new grants in certain areas are there. Nothing special, right? It's a very basic feature. But what it means is that then people can look for that. They see a grant that's interesting. They go and look at that grant instead of having to go and search through every week or something like that. And so we have, a lot of signups with that. The biggest piece has been that we just did a check-in session with both grant seekers and grant makers, one with grant seekers and one with grant makers. And we had, think about 90 on the grant seeker side and about 50 in the state grant maker side. And everyone said, yes, we want to continue these dialogues. Like, we'd love to have quarterly meetings. We want to, and we let people know, here's what's on our bug list, right? Help us know there's some things that are critical. We got to get them done. Some things are more about what's more important to you as a user. So let us know what's more important to you because we want to prioritize that, right? We are not building this for us. We are building this with you.
Excellent. So so we're bringing this kind of full circle. It's connectivity is important. Why? Because you have to have access to information that can help you in your personal life, in your professional life. It's just how we communicate nowadays. Government is now on top of this, realizing that in this digital age, we have to be able to finance this stuff, this innovation that we're trying to do. And so what you've done in California is to make it much easier. Thank you very much, because I'm working on a project right now that we're going to be looking for massive grant funding. So making it all in one place, it just makes it so much easier. So I really thank you for that. So the library system, again, getting back to how people really connect with connectivity. If you're living in a rural area, maybe your library is where you actually have the connections or the access to connectivity that you need. How is it that, what libraries, do you see any particular libraries in California, especially those that you would, like San Diego, of course, they got lots of resources, it's going to be different. Do you see any libraries in California that are doing surprising things given where they are in the universe?
Well, I mean, there's so many libraries doing great and exciting things. Sometimes, it's often, like with everything, technology isn't going to be the lead, right? Technology is going to maybe be an enabler to allow something to happen. But there's a great story about, Napa during, as everyone knows, California's fire seasons have, increased in their severity. Napa with their connection through Scenic, their connectivity in the library stayed on. And so one of the things, libraries have always been places people go after emergencies to seek information, to fill out insurance forms, claims forms, and when libraries can be these sort of secondary emergency services, it's another piece in the fabric of resiliency within a local community. And in Napa, where you had everything else off, I mean, you had other local governments who were sending their social media updates through the libraries, through the connectivity that Napa had, right? And those are really, really important kinds of outcomes, right? A lot of what we've seen has been this acceleration, enhancement of the existing programs. I mean, Chula Vista has done amazing work with, with maker spaces, with programming like that. But it's when you allows it to go from something, a bit smaller to something that is that can really help serve a whole community. And of course, the pandemic has sort of flipped so much of that, right? Because the physical library isn't open, but libraries are still open and providing services.
Absolutely.
And whether it is completely reimagining, everyone knows about the summer books at the library and the reading, right, and prizes and all of this. Well, flipped on your head when the physical library building isn't open. Alameda County ran a really innovative program this year and brought in kids who wouldn't have otherwise probably been engaged in that same way, right? And it was, again, sometimes when you have a hand tied behind your back, like everyone, or both your hands when your physical building isn't open to the public, and you've got to really think about new ways. It forces you into this different mode of creativity. And certainly, libraries, many public libraries have online tutoring happening. They have San Francisco has had huge numbers of people showing up at some of their online programming, training for small businesses, things like that. I bet you all of those people may not have wanted to come to the physical library before, but they can come to their digital library, right? And so that's another, the physical library is always going to be really important. And as libraries continue opening back up, right, everyone's very excited because the place is very important, but also what is provided. There are many new ways to provide it now, and that's something that we're really seeing.
So I cannot believe that our hour is, we've already done so many more questions, but I know that we have other people there would also like to ask you questions. So let me just end in one final question. What does a librarian do in her spare time?
I would say that librarians do many things. I'm not a librarian. I get to work with librarians all day long, which is an amazing, amazing thing. For any of your listeners, when I think I do know that probably one of the more annoying things for most librarians is when someone says, "Why do you need a master's degree to sit behind a desk all day and check out books?" And most likely the person checking out your book in a larger library is not a librarian. But librarians have master's degrees. They are about finding and organizing information, helping you find the material that you want to support your educational, your cultural, your health, all of those kinds of goals. I will say we had our staff meeting yesterday for the California State Library, and we clearly have, we have cat lovers, as obvious, a lot of knitters. We have a Dungeons and Dragons fan club and a RuPaul fan club. So it's what you would expect from a bunch of really amazing, awesome, creative people who are passionate about providing service to their communities.
Fantastic. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. Libraries are throughout most of our communities in America and in California, including our rural areas. That sounds like a really good place to start. And of course, they need master's degrees. They're dealing with data, information. It seems to me like they're the master dot connectors of all times. So thank you, Anne. I'm going to now turn this over to my colleague, friend, and in crime, everything, and Marcus, who's going to help has some other questions and then moderate some questions from our audience. So thank you, Anne. It's been a great conversation. I'll just
thank you.
And that was brilliant. I took cryptic but extensive notes here that I'm going to go back and pour over because it's really interesting. I'm up in Oregon, in Portland, and I'm working with Link Oregon, which is doing a similar process that Scenic is involved in. We're behind the 8 ball a little bit compared to Scenic, but we're catching up quickly. And so, the connectivity aspects are critical here in Oregon, especially in some of the remote areas. And I think we're really sensitive to making sure that communities have that kind of connectivity. And we also just have a new measure on the bill here, at least in Multnomah County, to fund the libraries more extensively, which is exciting. So very clear that the important role that the libraries play in being hubs for information. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to go ahead and these are topics that you touched on, but maybe you can go a little deeper. Can you discuss some of the notable examples of programs in California that have enabled tech skills development that are administered through the library? I think you touched on that a little bit, but maybe if you can kind of take a deeper dive on that.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, maybe I'll go a little bit more broad,
Sure.
broad-based. I think one of the pieces that I think is really important when you look at where California is, and you see this in some other states that have been doing this work for a really long time, is that there are nonprofits that have been engaged in this work and libraries that have engaged in this work for decades, right? When the Gates Foundation initially decided to support libraries by providing computers and internet access, LA Public Library was one of the very first libraries in that pilot, across the country. I recently found a news article about it, and it was just amazing to sort of read what that was like then. And at the time, libraries were more about, they were providing the access, not necessarily all of the training. You had community technology centers, which were run by nonprofit organizations, where you had them providing more of the training and this wonderful relationship with libraries and nonprofits, and in making sure that all of the community was served in the way they wanted to. But in California, one of the things I think is important in the history is that one of the first big philanthropic funding efforts in the state was not by, it was a health funder. And, it was, I believe it was the California Wellness Foundation, right? And they funded early on a project called Computers in Our Future. And there were these nonprofits all around the state. And they were engaged up, from Siskiyou County down to San Diego in trying to provide technology training and opportunities to their communities. Mm-hmm. And it became really clear that part of the way that was going to be able to happen was by making sure that the folks who were making the funding decisions up in Sacramento knew what the situation was on the ground and knew what kind of funding was going to be needed. And so that created essentially like an advocacy group, right? And it was the Brzee Foundation, it was the Children's Partnership, it was folks in Riverside. I was very fortunate and lucky to get involved when I was in San Diego. And that grew into a statewide policy group that held an advocacy day. And that's what helped change and create some of the laws in the early and mid 2000s in the state that supported local digital literacy, digital inclusion programming and funding. And so I start with that because I think it's important for us to remember that the changes, just like in municipal broadband, these changes that are happening now in terms of the funding and the focus, they didn't erupt out of nowhere, right? There's been this groundwork that's been laid. And there may be, it may be taking on different faces and and different terms now, but it's kind of coming from the same place. And so with libraries, there's almost always everyone provides basic digital literacy skills. Everyone will tell you that someone still comes in and says, "Can you show me how to get an email address? I don't know," right? But then it goes up to, as Deb was talking about, right? Maker spaces, programming classes, things like that. And I think that as libraries also then work very locally, and the programs that they have really should be reflecting and do what's happening in their community. So, if there's a really strong technology training program that is being run by the workforce agency, maybe it's not the library that needs to run it, or maybe the library is the best place to hold it because it's a more welcoming environment for people, right? So I think that it really depends on what's needed, what's needed in that community and what people want. I mean, one of the things libraries, like, everyone else, they serve a huge and varied constituency. And so making sure that there's something for everyone is really important so that everyone feels welcome.
That's a perfect segue. So I have one more question from the audience, but I want to kind of color that a little bit. So I'm curious, over the last, I don't know, pick a period of time, COVID, I'm sure color's part of it, but how has the demographic changed in terms of who's using the library and what services they're after? And then the question that came from Shannon in the audience is, can you give some examples of effective methods that localities have employed to build trust among diverse stakeholders? So what does the diversity look like now? And in what ways are you doing community outreach, or have the communities themselves built that kind of trust?
Well, one of the things I think we often say about libraries is it's one of the only places in American civic life where people willingly come together and from so many different walks of life and spend time, right? But what you do see is, depending on age, education, gender, income, ethnicity, that often drives some of the types of programming or services used in the library. There's some really wonderful research on that by John Horrigan when he was, I think I'm forgetting whether it was the Pew Report or whether it was at Urban Library Council, but he really talks about who are the folks who are coming in for programs to take classes, and the folks who are coming in to just sort of check out a book, right? I mean, certainly checking out materials is still really important, but while we go to check out a book, we also now can go and check out a museum package, right? And it's like passes to the local museum, arts and crafts, things like that. And I think one of the pieces in California, libraries have been engaged in, a many-year effort to be able to make sure that they are listening to and reflecting the needs of their communities and constituencies. And there's been a lot of training supported the Harwood model through the state library for local governments. And really that idea is, asking with libraries, asking the communities, what is it that they're looking for? Not in the library. I still really remember that from a training I went to with them, where they said, listen, if you ask them, do you want us to keep, running this program and checking out books and doing this kind of stuff? Everyone's going to say, yes, those are the things you should be doing.
Sure.
If you say, what are your needs in the community? Then you hear what the real needs are, and then you can assess, is the library the right place for that, right? And some of my colleagues in library land are far more involved and knowledgeable about this area than I am. So I would defer to their expertise on that. I think in the broadband area, it's again, not, it's hard to find the tangible outcomes of a lot of planning processes, right? The local consortia, the planning teams. I do think that there's, it would be great from a research angle to better be able to align and watch that line from getting together to be able to see outcomes. I was always struck by, there was a meeting I went to in Nevada that was that was at one of the, I think it was in Douglas County, right? And it was at the local library, you had the CIO, you had the assistant city manager, you had the local broadband, and everyone was just sitting around the table, right? And now the limitation is that your local broadband provider isn't going to be able, is going to have sort of this is our funding, right? And this is where we can, help prioritize. So it's going to be with the pieces that are already on the chessboard, how do we move them around in the most efficient way, right? And hearing and understanding the concerns of the different groups at the table. It can add new, right, chess pieces to the table.
Sure.
If you're able to start going after grant funding, if you're able to start looking at, different kind of financing models. But even if you're not, even if, or you get to a place, people may disagree on where the priority is, but you're telling them in advance. And I mean, I don't mean to sound all Pollyanna-ish at this, because at some level, this goes through a city council or county supervisors. And we know that there's a lot of politics that go on as soon as, as something gets to that level. But the more trust you can bake in early on, the better those conversations are likely to be, right? And I think that's, I mean, if there's anything, I think we all, so many of us, can agree that we have lost in, in the last, few decades, is that sort of that civic fabric. And to the extent that folks can come together and talk about those things around a common issue, right? Not just to sort of talk, hey, we're neighbors, we don't know each other, but you're talking about a common need. I think that can really bring folks to the table. And I just do want to say that was something we really found with the state broadband initiative. I mean, very different politics across those states, right? Yeah. And there were states where our grantees never tried as infrequently to mention that it was an ARA project as possible, because you know what, their governors were not, they did, if Obama did it, then it was the wrong thing to do.
Yes.
You can still get the work done, right? And developing those personal relationships so that, the folks who are going to be up here talking about that stuff, they don't have to worry about it. You're getting the work done on the ground. And we saw that happening in some states and learned a lot from and with each other.
Got it. And actually, that's a good segue, since broadband sort of opens up the library field to not just the walls of the library, but well beyond that. But in terms of that being a portion of what the library does, to what extent do you think that our relationship now with each other and with data acquisition, because of COVID, because of needing to stay safe and healthy, do you think that that's going to make an impact on the way that libraries are going to operate in the future? And in what way might that impact the programs, the materials? What kind of expectations should communities have based on what's happening now and what might happen in the future?
Well, I think we're so much in the middle of this still, right? And what we're seeing is libraries innovate innovate in real time to be able to continue serving their communities, even if it's not in the same way, right? And we know that, even in places where there's, maybe there's a limitation on the percent of patrons who can be in the building, folks are seeing less of that, right? Because people in some people are uncomfortable. They don't know if they can go in and
Sure.
And should they go in and safety. So I don't know that we know what a post-pandemic world looks like, but I do know that in my 5 years that I've been, at the state library and working with public libraries across our state, they are both resilient institutions, but also with a really long memory. And I think that's part of what's so important. And like I'm going to say here, there are folks who will say, I'm not the expert on that, but I can go find you the expert. And I'm not the best person to know what's going to happen with libraries as we come out of this pandemic. They will come out stronger. Unfortunately, we will see some libraries probably close. As many of you know, libraries are nearly all funded by local tax dollars and local tax bases. And that means that as those are being decimated, libraries are as well. That is the one fact I can pretty much guarantee, unless there's more money that's going to come in. But how libraries will continue this period of, I don't want to call it reinvention, because it's not about reinvention, right? But it's about how do they meet their mission? How do they continue meeting their mission in this new world? And I think some of my colleagues would be great at talking and answering that kind of question.
Great. Well, and it's interesting because I've observed in preparing for this that it feels to me like the library is the one place where you're absolutely licensed to ask why. A lot of other places you're not really allowed to ask that question, and so the library becomes the stage for asking that about almost any topic, and that's a wonderful thing. Debbie, you had a couple of questions, and I think then we're kind of getting ready to close. Did you have some questions on interactive consortia?
I did, but let me just make sure that other people have had the chance. So actually from Mark.
Yeah, I got that one. I think I got that already. Yeah.
So basically, is there an organization across the globe, across local, regional, of folks, librarians and folks like yourself who talk to each other on a regular basis? And do you see any trends or opportunities that are common roadblocks that have come up during these discussions? We lost.
I'd certainly recommend talking to, the American Library Association does a lot of work. And in fact, I would say from the California angle, I want to just really recommend my colleague, Patty Wong, who also serves on the scenic board, is the president-elect of the American Library Association. She's the director of the Santa Monica Public Library. And prior to that, she was the head of YOLO. So she has both those urban and those rural areas, and she's just amazing, and is really a huge advocate of the importance of technology. There are absolutely, the library community is constantly, just like every library has a book club, right? The library community comes together in forums and groups. I belong to. There's a government documents group within ALA, and I belong to that because there's a lot of really important information around data, and that's a lot of what we do with the kind of research we do for the legislature and for the governor's office. There's a lot of work around technology. So, absolutely, there are. I'd also, certainly a sister federal agency to NIST is IMLS. And they do really important work, and they have some just amazing program officers who can really tell you what are happening with libraries and museums around the country.
Great. And then the last thing about data, we haven't talked too much about your real job as the California Research Bureau. It's like, okay, can we close?
I wanted to take a deep dive. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do? Who do you serve? And does the private industry get involved in benefiting from your data research? Like, how does that happen?
So I direct something called the California Research Bureau, which is a an arm of the library that is specifically designed to serve the legislature and the governor. And so we act as sort of a support staff to both of those groups in providing data and research to help them as they're deciding what kinds of policies they want to bring forward for the state of California. And so we do all sorts of policy research. Most of our work is confidential. That is again in that enablement of trust with when folks are able to ask us questions about a policy or what's happening here, what's happening in another state, what kind of impact, and they know that it'll just go to them. It allows us to be able to give them the, they can ask us the honest questions and we can give them the honest answers. We do provide, we do a number of public reports. We've probably done about 300 or so since we were founded in 91, 92. And those are all on the library's website. We also do a number of interactives. So we have one is we do a data set, an interactive profile on the gender and racial and ethnicity diversity within California's legislature. And that's something we'll be publishing again as soon as the next election is over. And because we always have, some movement in with elections. And we also publish something called a district profile tool, which takes a number of open data sets that are already in place. So those go from our Cal Enviro screen, which is environment, to census data at the federal level, to educational data from our constitutionally separate Office of Education. And we put that all in one place and we allow people, they can compare by legislative districts and they can compare by Senate districts and across counties. And so our work is primarily for those two groups, the legislature and the governor, but anything that we can make public, we do, because we do want that to be able to be of service to other folks in the state. And we are, of course, indebted to other research institutions, to private organizations and businesses, because we call and ask them for research and information so that we can make our analyses and provide them to our clients.
So it seems like there's a lot of different reasons to go to the library portal, not for the reasons we thought about originally, right?
There's a lot there.
Yes, please go visit library.ca.gov.
Excellent. All right. Well, that seems like a really awesome note to end this conversation. I know we could go on forever. We might have you back when we have further information about how this works across the United States. But thank you so much, Anne. This has been a really great interview. I can just imagine in my head all the information that we got going into our research and what we want to create for the United States in terms of education and the best practices, especially the impacts of COVID have changed everything. So we're going digital, we're going the way everybody else is. So that's how we're going to do our research. So thank you, Anne. Anne, you want any closing remarks? And Marcus?
No, it was wonderful. I really appreciate it. I learned so much. And there's, I'm now going to figure out what the corollary for all this stuff is in Oregon and figure that out for myself. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Exactly. And across the United States. So those of us in the education cluster are going to be looking more closely at home as regards because of this conversation. So thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you. It was great. It was great to be here, and I appreciate you having me.
Great.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Bye.